This podcast is part of the Deluxe Edition Network. To find other great shows on the network, head over to deluxeeditionnetwork.com. That's deluxeeditionnetwork.com.
Historical fiction books can teach us a lot. But what do you get when you have an author who is from the place that she's writing about and a book that's full of truths? You get a blockbuster read. Join me as I talk with author Laura Quinn on this episode of True Crime and Authors.
Welcome to True Crime and Authors Podcast, where we bring two passions together. The show that gives new meaning to the old adage, truth is stranger than fiction. Here's your host, David McClam.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of True Crime and Authors. Of course, I am your man, David McClam. Hey, if you guys haven't done so already, make sure that you subscribe to all of our social medias. You can find that link, one link only, in the link tree in the show notes of this podcast. Also, remember, we did just launch a Facebook group. Make sure you sign up for both the page and the group if you want to have access to myself, as well as what's coming down the line. All right, guys, if you have been following the show or paying attention to your calendars, you know that it is time for another author interview. And we have one great one for you today. Let me tell you a little bit about who our author is. She currently resides in southern New Jersey with her husband, 2 children, and spoiled tabby cat. When not writing or consuming copious amounts of coffee, she enjoys hiking, the beach, and spending time with her family. She is the author of what is now a runaway book called Thicker Than Water. She is Laura Quinn. Laura, welcome to the show.
David, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. I know that you are extremely busy and have been busy. Thicker Than Water has seemed to taking legs of its own and ran off. I'm very happy for you about that. So, of course, we had to have you here to discuss that a little bit.
Thank you.
So Thicker Than Water is your debut novel. Of course, it's going to have 2 books extra than that. So additional books is playing around this whole saga. We'll talk about a little bit more of that at the end so we can, get your dates and when they're coming out, promote that. So I guess my first question for you is indie author. So I asked this to all of my authors. You're independent right now. Is that by choice, or if a big publishing house came to you, would you want to go that route?
It's currently by choice. Everybody's path to publishing is different, and I have nothing but the utmost respect for those who have braved the querying trenches and gone the traditional route. With respect to my work, I really wanted to retain a creative freedom. So that is why I chose to publish independently.
And I totally respect that. A lot of authors I talk to, same reason. I just like to ask that question to see, where you're gauged at. I'm glad because we get more books from you guys usually from what I hear when you're indie published. So that's always a good thing.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I'm not opposed to, going hybrid if the opportunity presented itself. Where, you never know what the future holds. But for this series, self-publishing was a choice.
So let's talk a little bit about Thicker Than Water. I guess my first burning question, which is probably, I'm sure you've been asked this a million times. What was your inspiration behind writing Thicker Than Water?
My son, actually. He is 12 now. But when he was a baby, he was a terrible sleeper. He's my firstborn. I spent a lot of time up with the baby. And when I was rocking him, the story of Danny and Jenny was one that I used to tell myself just to keep myself awake. They have taken up rent in my head for a number of years since then. Like I said, he's now 12. So about 3 years ago, I said, I better just write this down. And I wrote a short story about them, and it kind of just took off from there.
Well, that kind of leads into my next question. You kind of answered a little bit, which is how long were you thinking about this book before you wrote it? So was it just that 3-year span, or was it longer than that?
With the research and the planning, it was the 3-year span. But the story itself has been there for, over a decade. I'm just really excited to have the chance to tell it and get it out there. And
so this is a historical fiction book. which means a lot of research had to be done to write this book as detailed and as awesome as you did. Where did you do a lot of your research, and did your research take you to any place new?
I did a lot of it at home, in my dining room. A lot at local libraries have been great resources. I'm also a New Jersey resident. So my novel is set in South Jersey and in Philadelphia, where I worked for a number of years. So I have access to a lot of resources locally, which is wonderful. And I did, utilize those resources where possible. A number of historical societies have been immensely helpful. Just kind of took off from there. And, I have the opportunity to go to a lot of the places that are referenced in the book, or will be in the next two books, which is really kind of neat, especially when you're trying to re-describe them.
Yeah, I was reading a lot of that, and the towns really embraced you. You've been in several newspapers now about this. So when you started getting published in newspapers, I know because I followed you on Instagram, it was kind of a shock to you at first, but then it seemed to just pick up. So when that happened, how did you feel?
Press has been overwhelmingly receptive, extremely, extremely humbling, because it was unexpected. I did do a press release. I did pitch the media, which is normal part of any book launch, whether you're, indie or traditionally published, you're letting people know. But the response from the media has just been overwhelming. They've been, really engaged and helpful. And the Jersey Shore, Cape May, Wildwood, and the communities of beachgoers and readers, it's overwhelming. It's literally a dream come true. It's, when you sit down to write and you think, this is how I think it's going to go, or ideally, this is what I would like to happen. And it's gone beyond what I thought was going to happen. So it's really amazing. And I'm really grateful.
So besides Frank Hilton, which we will get to in a minute, are any of the events in the book real?
Yes. There really was a naval base in Cape May. It is now the U.S. Coast Guard Training Center. So those who are listening who are familiar with the shore area, it's on Cape May Harbor. And they built the Coast Guard base on the existing Navy base. Today, as a matter of fact, was the start of the Battle of St. Mihiel, which occurred in the Western Front during the Great War, World War I. And that was a battle that one of my characters was involved in. And that was fought until September 16th. The Spanish flu pandemic actually struck in 3 waves. My book only really pertains to the 4th and most catastrophic wave, the 3rd wave, that those events occurred in October of 1918. A number of minor plot points also really occurred, including this book touches on the beginnings of Prohibition. There really were laws precluding the sailors from drinking on the base. It was really a very, very early prohibition that was limited to this Navy base. And that kind of plays out in the narrative.
So the other question I had is, you just mentioned that you had, you talk about the flu in your book. Did the COVID outbreak affect you, or was that part of the book written before COVID-19 took place?
All of my research was completed prior to the 2020 lockdowns. I actually wrote my first chapter in March of 2020. And the week later, we know what happened. Right. And it was really terrifying because I was fresh off of this research. And I knew the numbers about the Spanish flu. I knew, the catastrophic results, and I had planned on expanding on them, in the book. And, some of the fears that are my characters are mine. I think at one point they were everyone's. At some point in the last 2 years, we're all definitely in a much better place now, thank goodness. But that was really scary. And during the editing and revisions of the manuscript, I went back and forth with my beta readers, also, with my editor. Like, do I even include them? Is it too much? How are readers going to react? Because the current pandemic, I know, people did lose, there were a lot of lives lost, and a lot of heartbreak, a lot of hurt. reading is supposed to be enjoyable for the most part. So ultimately, I chose to keep them in. But I mean, that was a 50-50 back and forth, almost right up through the final revisions.
So even though being that in that era, that was a part of what was going on, right? That's how people got sick and everything like that. And I think when you read a book, you have to take the book in context of when the book was written, not for today's. So being with that, did you get any backlash from anybody or any readers because of that in COVID and have to explain that to anybody?
I did not. My readers have been, also overwhelmingly supportive. Now, that's not to say that somebody down the line is not going to enjoy it, and everybody is certainly entitled to their own opinion. But I haven't gotten really any pushback or criticism, with regard to how I wrote the Spanish flu chapters. So I do think that I did my due diligence there from a sensitivity standpoint. It was, like I said, it was a major concern. So it seems to be, readers seem to have been receptive to the overall ending of the book in terms of it being a satisfying conclusion leading into the rest of the series.
No, I thought it was written very well. Like I said, the way I read the book was it was written in that time when Spanish flu happened. I was a big fan of Oregon Trail. They got everything from Spanish flu to cholera and everything else in that game.
Did you survive?
I did, yeah. Some of my friends didn't, but I did somehow. But I do think you have to look at the book for the era in which it was written in. And in your era, that was certainly something that went on. And I think that you would have probably cheapened the story a little bit if you didn't write that. So I am glad that you did leave that in. So let's stop making the people wait for what they really want to hear. Can you tell us about Frank Hilton and the multi-million-dollar rum ring?
So Frank Hilton is one of my real life characters. My core four are all fictional and figments of my imagination. Frank Hilton was a real person, and he was from Wildwood. His family did own a fishery, which was a completely legitimate business. His father helped build up the community that is now considered North Wildwood. At the time, it was called Anglesey. And he was one of the founders. He was on hospital boards, churches, fire departments, you name it. And Frank was his son, and he was a wayward son. And, he had other plans and a very good business mind. He just, chose to operate a criminal enterprise. Writing him is really fun because, if I say names like Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, you probably have heard of these men. Frank Hilton, I could not even find a picture of. He did not want to be known. So most of his actions are fictional. Most of his dialogue is fictional. A lot of his actions actually are not, and they're based on my research. But getting to see kind of how he would have win is fun. It's almost like a blank slate because there's really, I couldn't find one picture. And he did have some high-end connections. So that was surprising to me.
I agree with that because I went on a whole entire Google search for Frank Hilton. And the only thing I really found was a lot of people mentioned you. There was articles that's been written since you did the book. There was, I think, one article that said Frank Hilton and who he was. And then the only photos that showed up was some little old black guy that had a whole bunch of booze next to him. Like, that definitely ain't Frank Hilton. So I try to do research on him too. I wanted to know more about him after reading your book. And just as you say, is as like he never existed. There's nothing there at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild. He had some high-end connections. He had a partner in Philadelphia named Boo Boo Hoff, Max Boo Boo Hoff. And I cannot say that with a straight face because I just think of Yogi Bear. I grew up with Yogi Bear. The guy also wore a bow tie. And it's comical to me. But he was a big player in Philadelphia. He was Frank's connection in Philadelphia. Frank was in the shore area, and he would bring it in and get it to the city. Hoff also owned many legitimate businesses in Philadelphia, including his own hotel, 2 speakeasies that operated as restaurants, and the Franklin Mortgage Company, which was an investment company, and that's how he laundered all his money. Incidentally, currently in Philadelphia, there is a Franklin Mortgage Investment Company that operates as a speakeasy as part of the nightlife. So I find that amusing, and they're still open. They do quite well. It's really neat. If you're ever in Philadelphia, it's a neat experience.
So out of your research, if Frank Hilton was running this business in today's world, how much money would he have right now?
The numbers based on pre-COVID, pre-inflation, and we'll say, early 2020 numbers, like $85 billion.
Wow.
A lot of money. And he brought in a number of radio stations operated under him. That was, his brainchild, the warehouses, the fishery, and the transport. A lot of the transport was completely legitimate if you were looking at the trucks that he was using, because he was using his family's trucks.
Well, whatever he did to stay off the grid, because every other gangster or every other person that did things like this, about them. Like you said, Al Capone, Bumpy Knuckles, all these guys, they tried to fly under the radar and they never quite made it. Well, Frank Hilton made it because we don't even know anything else about him. So,
yeah, well, and I will say, and it's not so much a spoiler because it's a historical event, such as the Spanish flu. So in 1928, the feds got wise to Franklin Investments and what it really was. They dug in from there. Frank was identified as a leader and fled to Canada. So he kind of self-exiled to Montreal, but he was still the boss of the area from Canada, working with Hoff in Philadelphia. Lots of aliases. That was probably a big part of it. They ultimately had enough evidence to try him as of 1933. And were trying to extradite him home. But he ended up dying of natural causes at 43 in Montreal. And there's really, he didn't go out in a blaze of glory like there's, and I don't consider that spoilery because that, being historically accurate is important to me. Yeah, he just flew completely and there was no record of any marriage, children. He wanted to be anonymous.
Well, he certainly accomplished that. I think Frank Hilton is one of the most enjoyable parts of reading in this book. So make sure you guys go out and get Thicker Than Water because you want to know all that she researched about Frank Hilton. So that brings me to, can you tell us a little bit about your writing style and process?
I am very much a plotter. I take notes. Everything is plotted out, bullet list style. Chapter 1, this is going to happen. That's going to happen. Chapter 2, 1, 2, 3. And then I embellish from there. And then a lot of the magic really happens in the editing process. And I have a great beta team. I had a great editor. They really helped me, flesh out these characters and give me the feedback that I needed to take it to the next level in order to publish, fleshing out some plot holes, changing the book is told in multiple point of view. And there were some chapters during editing that I completely rewrote. It was written in, say, Danny's perspective, and I changed it to his sister's and vice versa. But they were necessary changes. And I think that the end product was better, certainly better than it was, before the editing. I have a great team, and I'm really thankful for that.
Now, there was a few tough areas in the book, especially around a little bit some child abuse that happened in that. Why did you want to touch on those?
Well, we had talked, earlier about, the creative freedom. And I did grow up in I grew up in an alcoholic home. I grew up in a home where there was domestic violence. I think it's important to accurately portray that. It was certainly cathartic for me. They are not, to be very clear, they're not personal experiences that these of mine that play out with the characters. But it was cathartic. There are some instances, where that does happen in those homes. The complex trauma and the PTSD that the characters have wasn't even called PTSD at the time. My one character, he goes to the Great War, he comes home. They would have called it shell shock, but really his trauma and his sister's is layered and what would be known as complex trauma. And that will play out and be a big part of both of their story arcs in the other two books as well. Because without proper treatment, you're never fully healed. I don't want to compare it to cancer, but cancer can go into a remission, whereas trauma you can heal from, but it's actually a brain injury that, left untreated can be passed on to other generations. So those are themes that I wanted to explore. They are darker themes, but it also helped me with my own recovery and finding a voice and talking about some unpleasantries. Because I think a lot of the stigma that can be associated with mental health conditions in general is that people don't talk about them, or they feel that they are alone. They feel that there's nobody to talk to, or even worse, they feel that, what happened to them or somebody that they care about, that they deserved that. And then that kind of generational trauma can also be passed on. So if nothing else, it's a talking point. You and I are talking about it, hopefully, people are definitely, listening to this podcast, and maybe it sets off, maybe I should check on this one, or, oh, I was talking to so-and-so the other day, and, it's okay to talk about. It should be talked about, and there's no shame in admitting, that something traumatic happened to you, and help is out there. A lot of help, so much help is out there. If somebody is listening to this and they're struggling and they don't even know where to turn.
No, I do applaud you for that. I too am a product of domestic abuse. I had an alcoholic father as well. My mom probably suffered more abuse than what she needed. My story is horrific, probably not as bad as somebody else's, but I always share that with people because of the fact of what you just said. A lot of people feel like that they're alone. A lot of us creative types, we hone what we went through and we put it into our creative forces. It is something that you truly never, ever outgrow. And I know growing up, he was like, oh, you'll outgrow it. No, you see, you never do. And I do believe that I suffer from PTSD. Maybe you have, some other people. Of course, back then it wasn't called that. A lot of counseling went into that. And even at my age now, you still deal with some of that stuff because you try to push back. You don't want to be the person that who your abuser was. And you always live with that fear. So I do think that when authors like yourself write about these things, it should be applauded because for all you know, you could be saving somebody's life. It doesn't matter if the story is real or not. It's just that what's been written, they can hone in on and say, hey, this person's just like me. Maybe I do have a reason to live. So I applaud you for that. I deeply appreciate you writing that in the book.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you.
All right. So can you tell us how you came up with Mr. Joseph York?
He's such a baddie. He is also very fun to write because he's such a jerk. He is the epitome of privilege. His dialogue and his actions are some of them were really uncomfortable to write because he holds opinions that I don't hold, that most people in their right mind do not hold. He has a lot of hate in his heart. He's a narcissist. And, I just made a list really of negative qualities. And unfortunately, there are people like him, out there walking, men and women, all walks of life that, he's really just the archetype for, they think they can get away with whatever they want with no repercussions, that they're entitled, that, they paid their dues or, because they have X amount in their bank account, they can do whatever they want. That's just not the way life works. I wanted to, he's a foil for some of my other characters. And I think his ultimate arc for me as the author was satisfying. And I hope that it was satisfying for readers because he was just such a baddie. And he caused so much heartache that was completely unnecessary.
I'll tell you who he reminded me of. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but my 20th wedding anniversary was August 23rd. And my wife and I went to see the musical Moulin Rouge on Broadway. And he reminded me a lot of the Duke in that, because that's exactly how the Duke is. He's full of himself. He wanted what he wanted. He thought he can buy the world. You know, I mean, even one of the songs he says, "I'm a man of wealth and taste." So he's letting you know. So when I was reading Joseph York, I'm like, he reminds me an awful lot of the Duke in Moulin Rouge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's, he fits in that character archetype. There are certain tropes that I did lean into when writing, to further flesh things out. When I first wrote him, some of my feedback was that he was actually caricaturish, and I didn't want that. I wanted somebody that was real. And I think that ultimately, with revisions that did come across. But yeah, he's not a nice guy.
So how does the different classes affect Thicker Than Water?
Well, you have, like I said, Danny and Shannon Culligan are locals. They live at the shore, and there was no middle class at the time. So it really was a world of haves and have-nots, and the disparity between the two was an abyss. So you have, the Culligans, who are year-round locals. Their father is an alcoholic fisherman. They live in a beach shack that was actually based off of what in New Jersey is known as the Judge's Shack on Long Beach Island. Shacks of that time, were kind of standard, and the judge's shack is still standing. But basically, it's a very small 2-bedroom, if that, wooden structure. And the other two characters, Jenny Martin and Hugh Calloway, are what's called cottagers. And I use that term loosely. It's not a cottage like you would think of today. It was like the mansions at the seashore. They hail from the Philadelphia upper elite. Hugh hails from New York society. Jenny lives in Philadelphia. So they are cousins. So that's the connection there. They summer at the shore. Many of the houses, Cape May is on the National Historic Registry. So a lot of those old hotels are still standing, and they're beautiful. Now they're hotels. At the time, they were single residences. So it's crazy to think about that. And these were their vacation homes, not even, just where they lived year round. So there's a big, economic disparity there. Forbidden romances, people who really don't have a lot in common, but they end up falling in love, and you can't help who you fall in love with. It's brainless. It just happens, and you can't make it unhappen. So, Danny and Jenny were childhood sweethearts. Their backstory that didn't really make it into the book was, they met when they were children, started out as friends, and it kind of grew from there. Shannon and Hugh fall into, friends to lovers. And they have a lot of communication problems. I would say, in both relationships with both couples, the class difference impacts them differently. Jenny is subject to an arranged marriage. She's a debutante. That was something that was expected of women of that time in that economic class. Shannon, it's not unheard of that she would have been working, and she probably would have been working 2 jobs. For characters like Jenny and you, they recognize their class, but they don't fully understand the privilege there, especially, being coupled off, with 2 people who are trauma survivors. So that was an interesting dynamic to play with.
So are there any parts of the book that you wish you did not write?
Honestly, no. Like I said, with regard to the Spanish flu, go back and forth with regard to those chapters. But I am glad that I wrote them, because it was important to move some of the character arcs forward. And some of the events that come out of the Spanish flu chapters are necessary to get my characters to where they need to be at the end of this book and then going into the next 2 books. There was also one scene with Danny while he is at war, because some of the trench warfare scenes are graphic, but it was trench warfare, and it was, if it's horrible to read, you have to imagine what it was like to actually be there. My grandfather was a vet. He didn't really talk about his experiences. We knew not to ask. They were bad. So I wanted to accurately capture that as well. And I could not sugarcoat certain details. So those chapters were hard to write, but I think They were important to the narrative. I'm not a proponent of gratuitous use of violence for shock value. They were written, with specific intent based on my research, as it pertained to, the Western Front and trench warfare, and how that will enter his psyche in the books to come.
All right. Well, we have a couple of fan questions, if you don't mind answering a couple of those.
Sure. I love hearing from fans.
So I went scouring all the posts that we have posted over the week. I only saw these. If there was more, I'm sorry. But I'm sure that Laura will come back again and we can ask the rest. So the first one comes from Pav Loves Books. His question was, how did you make sure each POV character sounded unique?
That is a great question. So again, I have a great team. These are my ideas, but there are so many other people that helped me, with this work. My beta readers, my editing team, even my husband, just, take these characters to the next level and take them from, cardboard to fully fleshed out. If I had a difficult time during drafting, changing point of views as the writer, and say, one chapter is told in Shannon's and the next one is in Jenny's, and I had a hard time bouncing from character to character. I made Spotify playlists of, what I think my characters would listen to by today's music. If that couldn't get me past writer's block, sometimes I would skip that chapter. All right, like Jenny's not talking to me today. Let's, I know what I want her to do. She's not doing it. Let's see what happens afterwards. And then I would kind of backtrack it and, filling in those skips, when she was talking to me, which sometimes was in the shower. Thanks, Jenny. In the shower or driving. Never when I'm actually at my laptop. But again, it takes a village, and I have a great one, and they really helped out immensely.
Well, this next one, I believe, is for both of us. It's for Lillian Sue, copywriter PR. She said, what responsibility do you believe authors and true crime podcasts both have to report the cases with sensationalism and with care and respect to both victims and their families? As an author, true crime aficionado, and supporter of true crime podcasts and working on a true crime thriller idea, I know of several podcasts have been accused of such. I'll let you go first with that one.
I have a criminal justice background. My bachelor's is actually in criminal justice, which I'd worked in insurance fraud for years and in another lifetime before entering the world of fiction. So professionally, I have had classes on, everything from corrections to victimology. Because I write historical fiction, there may be generations of family members, using Frank Hilton, for example, his descendants. But because his life was over a century ago, it's not as damaging as, if he was committing his crimes within the last 10 years. That being said, I do think we have to we have a responsibility, to be sensitive to both the victims and the family members and avoid pitchforking. And to take it out of the true crime context, I remember it was a few years back. It was a tragedy. Family takes their children to Disney World, and one of the children got pulled in by an alligator. I can't remember. Forgive me. I can't remember if they ever found the body or if they did. Either way, they lost their child to an alligator. And I remember it was all over both social media and network news. Where were the parents? Well, the parents were trying to get their son back, and they just lost, and they're grieving. They just lost their child. And it was like a pitchfork mentality. How could this happen? And, sometimes we see that in particular, as it relates to crime, if the perpetrator, was a minor or a young adult. And I'm not condoning any criminal activity, but I do think that people are responsible for their own actions, and, that we can't go forward with like a hive mentality or a pitchfork mentality, because you really don't know what's happening behind closed doors. And especially, with regard to victims, sometimes it goes into victim blaming. The case last year with the domestic violence, between the boyfriend and girlfriend, and she was on Instagram, and I think every outlet and every social media outlet, the shares of this girl crying hysterically and asking for help. And we all know what happened. People just laughing at her. And it's like, well, she's asking for help. And number one, nobody helped her. Her family also lost too. So I think basically, we need to think before we type, before we share. If it's not something that, you would say out loud or, say to some kindness first, like there a loss of life occurred or something catastrophic occurred, and just bringing down to another level of sensitivity, because there's many moving parts. Many of the issues are gray. Unless you're the lead investigator, you don't have all the facts or access to the crime scene. You can certainly speculate, but let the professionals, do their job first.
When it comes to me and true crime, I think I give it to you like it is. I'm very careful and respectful, but I feel like that as a true crime podcaster who's bringing the story, it is my job to do my best to bring you the whole story in the way that it was. Sugarcoating it and over sensationalism irritates me, because you're taking a part of the story, you're making it more dramatic than it has to be, or maybe you added something that wasn't there because you wanted to appeal to the public. I do true crime because there's stories that you should never forget, and you need to hear the whole story. Like the one you was just telling, which was about Gabby Petito was her name, her boyfriend Brian Laundrie. On my other podcast, A Day with Crime, we actually did that case. And I didn't sugarcoat anything. I think the cops was at fault for that. The cops was right there. You could see she was distressed. At that moment in time, I would have taken her and said, you know what? I just don't feel right about this case. Mr. Laundrie, you can go ahead and go to a hotel. I think that we'll feel better taking Miss Petito in. Nobody ever did that. And in a lot of other cases that I've done or that I've watched, especially this one, they wanted to sugarcoat, or maybe the cops just didn't know. Or maybe they just wasn't paying attention. That's what your job is, right? As a cop, you got tears coming out of your eyes. You even asking the question, what's going on? Is everything okay? But you leave her there. You can't sugarcoat that. It's not fair to the victim. It's not fair to the victim's family. And it's not fair to you, the listener, who is coming to this podcast to hear me tell you exactly what happened and the truth. Yes, like you said, victim blaming does happen. I try my hardest to stay away from that. Sometimes there does come questions. Hey, if your child fell into a pool and they drowned, is it harmful to ask, where were you at this time? Why didn't you know what was going on with your kid? I think those questions are important. But if somebody is in a domestic situation where they're getting beat down, you can't, well, it's her fault that she went into that. No, it's nobody's fault. You shouldn't be hitting anybody. You shouldn't be touching a woman at all. You should just walk away. So I don't sensationalize anything that you will hear on this podcast. I give you the truth. I leave a lot of things up to you, the audience, like the case that I recently did, which was on Vanessa Guillen. She was the young 20-year-old soldier that disappeared at Fort Hood, and she ended up getting killed. And there was, a part of that case where they think that the guy who did it, they say he shot himself, but they actually believe the authorities shot him because of the fact that there were higher ups in the Army that would have been exposed if he would have been able to tell his story. And I said, I don't know if it's true or not. I can certainly see it. What do you guys think? So I do think it's important as a true crime podcaster not to sensationalize anything, give you the straight story, hit it dead on the head, and then let you guys do with it what you wish. Pavs Loves Books and Lillian, we thank you for those questions. What's new? What's coming down the pipeline that we can look forward to from Laura Quinn?
A title reveal is coming in the fall. Later in the fall, I have a working title for book 2 that I can't wait to tell you guys. And I am hoping to release that next summer, because the books are set at the shore. It's nice to read them at the shore. If you are, in the beach area. Of course, they could be enjoyed everywhere, but a lot of the action, does take place down there. So that hoping for a release date of next summer. And then for the third one, I hope to release that in 2024.
All right, so a couple of years of writing ahead of you.
You're going to get some new characters, some returning favorites, some new characters, some new venues. We're going to go to, there was a racetrack outside of Atlantic City that's no longer there, but it was built to compete with Indianapolis. So if you, for listeners who are familiar with the size of Indianapolis, that was right here in New Jersey. We're going into, the jazz age, the roaring 20s. Writing it so far has been really fun because I love that era. I love the vibe about it, the music, and I hope that will come across in the writing.
So lastly, before we go today, is there anything that you would like to say to your fans and readers out there?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. The response to this debut has just been overwhelming. I'm grateful for every review, all of the reader feedback, every comment. I read all of your comments. I really try to engage and answer questions to the best of my ability. The support from readers, the book community, it's just wonderful. I can't really express, how grateful I am to have this experience, to be able to tell this story and to know that you guys like this story, and that, you like the characters, you're invested. It's my little book about the Jersey Shore, but it's so much more than just the Jersey Shore. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Laura, thank you for coming on the show today. Thicker Than Water is a great book. I wish you all the success. Anytime you want to come back, feel free. Hopefully after your next book come out, you'll come back and we'll talk about that one and talk about all the new characters you're writing.
Awesome. Well, thank you, David, for having me. This has been, like I said, it's my first podcast, and it was awesome. So thank you for being such an amazing host, and I wish you nothing but luck, with the rest of the episodes. I'll definitely be tuning in because, like I said, that's kind of something that we share, the same passion. So it's always great to connect with like-minded people.
Well, thank you, Laura. I certainly appreciate it. And good luck to you and all your future endeavors.
Thank you.
All right, guys, so you heard it here. That was the incredible Laura Quinn. You can pick up a copy of Thicker Than Water on Amazon. It is not that expensive. $4.95 will get you this fabulous book. Go out there and support her and let her know what you think of the book. Again, make sure you're following us on all social media. Everything about Laura Quinn will be on our website as well as in the show notes. Check out her website where she actually does post a lot of things that she talked about here today, including the playlist that she built for every character is there. I hope you guys are all being safe out there. Always remember these things. Always be humble. A little love and compassion goes a long way. And this is the podcast where two passions become one. Catch you guys in the next one.
Thank you for listening to True Crime and Authors. Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. Join us on social media. On Facebook at True Crime and Authors. On Twitter at Authors True. On YouTube and TikTok at True Crime and Authors. And email at truecrimeandauthors@gmail.com. Cover art and logo designed by Dazzling_Ray from Fiverr. Sound mixing and editing by David McClam. Intro script by Sophie Wild from Fiverr. And I'm the voice guy, your imaging guy from Fiverr. See you next time on True Crime and Authors.